This is episode 18 on wisdom. Again, we're on our 31-day journey through the book of Proverbs. Today is chapter 21. And today we're going to highlight a few verses that give us wisdom on being an argumentative person, wisdom on trusting God, and the wisdom on checking our motives. In chapter 21, verses 1 and 31, I see these two verses highlighting God's sovereignty. He says, "In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that channels toward all who please him." In verse 31, he says, "The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory rests with the Lord." This is one of my favorite verses to remind me of God's sovereign power and ability. That it is wise to remember that God is able to move the hearts of people, that when he desires, and as it is in alignment to his will, that he will move their hearts and impress their hearts. That it reminds us that we are always to trust God, that we are never to feel like we're limited by people or that we're stuck in any circumstance, that when we rest in faith and trust in God and pray to God and believe that he is able to move things and move people as he desires. And in verse 31, he says, "It is wise to make preparation, but remember it is God who is ultimately in charge to decide how we will succeed." In verse 2 and 21, again, we find these two verses are similar. He says, "A person may think their own ways are right, but the Lord weighs the heart." And in verse 21, he says, "Whoever pursues righteousness and love finds life, prosperity, and honor." That we see it as wise to understand that God knows the intentions and the motivations of our heart, that we may try to justify it in our actions or try to hide our motives, or even convince ourselves that we have good intentions. But when the outcome of our decisions and behaviors are not Christ-like, they're not displaying the fruit of the Spirit, then we need to be honest about our intentions, to reevaluate the motives of our heart, and that God will help us reveal those intentions and those motives. It is wise to pursue righteousness, love. And if we pursue righteousness and love, and that is our motivation, that life, prosperity, and honor will be a big part of what we will experience in our life. In verses 9 and 19, he gives us wisdom on the topic of being argumentative. That he says in verse 9, "Better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife." And in verse 19, "Better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome or nagging wife." That he, again, is showing us that it is foolish to be an argumentative person, to always finding fault, always looking for something to argue about or complain about. A fool never wants to agree on anything, and they are always looking for an argument, that's something that they disagree with, something that they want to be critical about, that there's no pleasing them. And their first knee-jerk reaction is to find what they don't like, that they are never satisfied. And Solomon says that living with a person like this, who is always nagging, who is always trying to find an argument, always being critical, that it is miserable. In fact, he says you would be better off living in an attic somewhere, on the roof, or in a rundown shack, or out in the desert somewhere. And that the wisdom that we find on this is that, don't be that guy. Don't be that husband. Don't be that wife. Don't be that teammate. Don't be that person that you want to be in a relationship with your spouse, on teams, on your job, at church, in your community. You want to be the person that is not always looking for an argument, but you're looking for where you can agree. Where can you build unity? Where can you find common ground with someone? He says in verse 23, "Those who guard their mouths and their tongues keep themselves from calamity." That he's saying it is wise for us to be intentional with our mouth, that we choose our words carefully. What kind of impact will our conversation have on a person or a situation? That we understand that we put filters on our mouth if we need to, that we don't just say everything we feel or that we think, that we consider and choose our words wisely, that we speak with emotional intelligence. And if we do, that our relationships will be healthy. I pray today that we find the wisdom in chapter 21 today. One of the highlights that I see is that to make sure that I'm not that argumentative person, that we all have opinions, we all have things that we like or dislike, but really check, how are we bringing health to our relationships? How are we being a person who is supportive? So I pray today that you find this wisdom beneficial for your lives, and that you'll find the blessings of God will always follow when we choose wisely.